No, not really. There are no more Soviets, and we are not in a Cold War situation. Nevertheless, tensions between Russia and the West are high, and Putin is behaving like he is preparing for war. I can see many worried people, and there's lots of speculations about Russia's aggressive intentions. And that's my problem. In most accounts I hear, it seems to me that the entire situation is framed wrong. I don't think Russia has plans of aggression, and I don't think we're on the brink of war. But I do think that the way the situation is being wrongly framed is contributing to the tension. So, to show you a different perspective, here is how I perceive the current standoff. Let's go back to the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991. This created a domino effect that brought down many other dictators around the world, who no longer had the Soviets to back them up. The perception was that democracy won the fight against communism, and many countries around the world adopted a democratic system. The problem was that the culture in those societies was not prepared for democracy, so in the years since we have seen many of them sliding back to a more despotic system. In the late 90s we witnessed the rise of a new kind of despotic leader, exemplified mainly by Putin in Russia, Chavez in Venezuela and Erdogan in Turkey. They were strongmen who were elected in a democratic way, but then proceeded to slowly and methodically centralize power and dismantle the democratic system in their countries. They also formed an alliance with the remaining dictators, protecting each other from the winds of democracy. Realizing that the old dictators were brought down partly by global electronic media and human rights organizations, they formed their own media outlets, and also adopted and subverted the human rights discourse. Today's dictators keep a semblance of democracy, while actually holding all the power. Still, in many countries democracy did take hold. One of the biggest success stories was Eastern Europe, where the former communist states became prosperous democracies. A more complicated story were the countries of the former Soviet Union, where the transition was harder. In the years of the Union, many Russians moved into these countries, and now that they became sovereign states, these Russian citizens wanted to remain connected to Russia instead of turning towards the West. The first conflict to come out of these tensions occurred in the early 90s in Moldova, when a civil war broke out between national Moldovan and pro-Russian forces, ending up in part of Moldova breaking away and declaring itself a sovereign state called Transnistria, a state that isn't recognized by any UN member. This was a sign of things to come. After the fall of the USSR, the United States remained the only superpower, and some Americans thought that it had a moral obligation to use this power to advance democracy and freedom around the world. Known as neoconservatives, they reasoned that an aggressive US policy against dictators will embolden pro-democracy forces and drive them to topple the authoritarian regimes. This reasoning did have some basis in reality, but the neocons failed to consider the other side of the equation. American conservatives see their country as a force of good in the world, and they tend to think that the rest of the world see it that way as well. They don't realize that many people around the world see the US as an imperialistic force that is out to dispossess them. So when the Bush administration adopted neocon policies in the early 2000s, this was exploited by many dictators and terrorists, who convinced their countrymen that they are the only ones that can defend them from the Americans, and should therefore be given more power. Hugo Chavez gained enormous popularity and power in Latin America by presenting himself as the antithesis to Bush, and used that power to establish his dictatorial rule over Venezuela. And in Russia, Putin used the fear of many Russians that they are being infiltrated by American forces to centralize power and become the country's despot. In other places, though, we did see democratic revolutions in those years, particularly in the former Soviet countries of Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova, that went through the so-called color revolutions and started to move towards the EU and the West. Putin believes that the West had something to do with those revolutions, and that made him paranoid. He believes that he is next in line, that once the West manages to westernize these countries it will turn to Russia. And this is one of the things that is hardly being mentioned in the Western discourse about Putin's motives. We are told that Putin and Russia have aggressive intentions towards Europe, when actually, when you listen carefully to what the Russians are saying, it seems that their belligerence is really a reaction to what they perceive as the West's aggressive intentions towards them. Russia is not strong enough to go against NATO and attack any country that is under the West's sphere of influence. All it can do is stand its ground and try to maintain its own sphere of influence. But this sphere of influence is shrinking, and that is due to another common Western misconception about Putin. Putin is seen by many in the West as a brilliant strategist, when in fact, he has proven to be a disastrous leader when it comes to protecting Russia's foreign affairs interests. Despite the color revolutions, Russia was still the strongest outside influence on the politics of Georgia and Ukraine, and counted these two countries in its own sphere of influence. But in 2008, when Georgia witnessed inner tension between Georgian nationalist and pro-Russian elements, Putin reacted by invading Georgia and coming to the help of the pro-Russian forces. This resulted in the formation of two new countries, South Ossetia and Abkhazia, that broke away from Georgia and joined Transnistria as countries that no one in the world recognizes. So Putin gained two very small countries that are pro-Russian, but lost the majority of Georgia, where the politics became decidedly anti-Russian. Russia still had Ukraine, a more important piece in its sphere of influence, and things were looking up for a while. In 2010, Ukraine elected the pro-Russian Viktor Yanukovych for president, and he proceeded to follow the Putin formula of slowly dismantling the Ukrainian democracy and taking it back towards dictatorship. Alas, this scared the pro-Western elements, and in late 2013 they began protesting. And once again, Putin miscalculated. Instead of encouraging Yanukovych to settle with the protesters, he pressured him to get tough on them. This resulted in a coup, which ousted Yanukovych and replaced him with a pro-Western government. This incensed the pro-Russian Ukrainians, and two heavily Russian-populated provinces in the east of the country rebelled against the new government. Putin probably could have still found a way to maintain his influence, but instead he annexed Crimea and sent the Russian army to invade East Ukraine, turning the Ukrainian population against him. More than 90% of Ukraine is now completely out of Russia's sphere of influence. The Ukrainian conflict is one of the biggest causes of the current tension between the West and Russia. But this was always going to happen. Any time one of the former Soviet Union countries split between its pro-Russian and pro-Western elements, the result is a rise in global tensions. Ukraine was expected to be the most dangerous case, and the conflict there is not resolved yet, but it seems that the worst is behind us. So actually, we are less likely to have a war between the West and Russia than we ever were before. The end result in Ukraine will be that Crimea, and maybe Donetsk and Luhansk, will join those small parts that were torn off Moldova and Georgia and become disputed territories, until the day when Russia becomes closer to the West and the disputes can be fully and amicably resolved. There are now only 3 European countries left under the Russian sphere of influence: Belarus, Kazakhstan and Armenia, so there are still potential tensions to come. But, like I said, when it comes to the prospects of Eastern Europe causing World War III, it seems that the biggest dangers are behind us, so I feel much less anxious about it than ever before. The other region that is responsible for the current tension is, you guessed it, the Middle East. After the fall of the Soviet Union, the Middle East was fully under the American sphere of influence, with the exception of 3 rogue states: Iran, Iraq and Libya. After 9/11, when the Bush administration adopted the aggressive stance of the neocons, Libyan dictator Gaddafi got scared and decided to stop being rogue. He started cooperating with the West, but at the same time also kept good ties with Russia. The US invasion of Iraq, however, had negative results, as it emboldened the anti-American forces in the region. Syria broke away from the American sphere and joined Iran to form the so-called Axis of Resistance, which also included jihadist groups Hezbollah and Hamas. Putin sensed an opening, and managed to get Syria back under the Russian sphere of influence. Syria became a very strategic ally to Russia, its only port in the Mediterranean, and it is very important to Putin not to lose this ally. As I've mentioned before, the dictators figured ways to circumvent the dangers posed to them by electronic media and human rights organizations, but they didn't bring the internet into account, and in the beginning of this decade this resulted in new uprisings, especially in the Middle East. Obama's and Putin's responses to the Arab Spring were very different. Obama reacted in the best way possible, and stood by the protesters. In the countries that were under America's sphere of influence, like Egypt, Tunisia and Yemen, he supported the transfer of power from the dictator to someone who will remain a US ally and oversee a transition to democracy. As expected, the transition to democracy proved to be very problematic, but these countries are still relatively under control and still part of the American sphere. Because of that, Obama can muster local forces to help fight against the jihadists that are exploiting the chaos to take control over geographic areas. In recent years, we've seen jihadist enclaves forming in Somalia, Pakistan, Yemen and Mali, and they were all beaten back by local forces with American aid. The current jihadist enclave that formed in America's sphere of influence is the Islamic State in Iraq, but it too is now in the process of being defeated. Thus, without spending too many American resources, Obama succeeded in preventing the Middle East from sliding into total chaos. Libya is a slightly different story, but here, too, Obama displayed his diplomatic savvy. Gaddafi enjoyed the protection of Putin and could not be persuaded to transfer power. Obama allowed the Arab countries to lead the diplomatic moves against Gaddafi, thus denying him the ability to present himself as the hero fighting against the imperialist West. Once the UN sanctioned the military intervention in Libya, NATO supported the rebel forces that finally rid the world of Gaddafi and his psychotic family. As expected, Libya then descended into chaos and civil war, but the US is okay with this result. The Americans have a lot of experience with helping countries transition from dictatorship to democracy, and they know that sometimes it takes decades of violence and chaos before the transition is achieved. They are willing to take that risk. The Russians don't understand this American attitude. The way they see it, rule of law is always preferable to anarchy, no matter if it is democratic or dictatorial law. Russians simply don't get how important democracy and the spread of democracy are to the Americans, so they always suspect that they have other motives. Putin, it seems, sees the ousting of Gaddafi as part of the American plan to weaken Russia, and this made him even more paranoid. And so we get to Syria, the Arab Spring country that was under Russia's sphere of influence, and here we can witness Putin's bungling foreign policy in all its glory. Putin could have controlled the Syrian situation if only he acted like Obama did with America's allies. Persuade Assad to step down and transfer control to someone who will remain pro-Russian while being acceptable to the protesters. Instead, he supported Assad's iron fist reaction, which plunged Syria into civil war and turned the country into a chaotic bloodbath. Among the catastrophic results of Putin's decision-making were the rise of ISIS and the migrant crisis. For Russia, it meant needing to spend ever-growing resources to keep Assad in power. Obama's Syrian policy was to aid the rebels. However, the rebels failed to show that they can be trusted, so the support they get from him is very limited. Many are blaming the Americans for allowing Assad to slaughter his own people when they can use their force to bring him down and stop the massacre, but there is no guarantee that this will make the situation better. For instance, if the Sunni anti-Assad forces take over, they might then proceed to massacre the Alawite minority, and the Americans will get blamed for it. The Americans spent years trying to get the Syrian opposition to come to terms with the Alawites, but to no avail. The Syrian opposition also refuses to disavow the Islamist and jihadist elements within it. In Libya, the opposition was much more organized and trustworthy, and still it couldn't avoid falling apart once it came to power. The Syrian opposition seems much worse, and it would be extremely foolhardy to bank on it. Still, the Americans might have taken their chances with this opposition and helped it overthrow Assad, but when it might also ruin its relations with Russia, it is not worth the risk. And this, in my opinion, is what is behind the current Russian saber-rattling. It is Putin letting the West know that he is willing to go to war to protect Assad, calculating that the West will not take the chance. And I am positive that the West will back down. It simply has too little to gain and too much to risk by going against Putin on this. The US has already scored two major victories in Syria. First, it significantly weakened the resistance axis. Secondly, it cleared the country of its chemical weapon stockpile. They will be satisfied with this result. Putin's admirers claim that he managed to outsmart the Americans and establish his dominance over Syria. They are forgetting that Syria was already part of the Russian sphere of influence even before the Arab Spring began. When I point it out to them, they say, yes, but now he has more influence in Syria than he had before. That is true, but what does that mean? All it means is that Russia is now stuck in Syria in the same way that America found itself stuck in Iraq and Afghanistan, in a situation where the existence of its ally government is dependent upon its support, and it has to spend resources just to keep it alive. And they are probably going to be stuck in this situation for many years to come, because the majority of the Syrian population now consider Assad not a legitimate leader but a butcher. I'm racking my brains to understand how anyone can think that this is a win for Putin and Russia. Hillary Clinton is now a clear favorite to be the next US president, and sources in Washington say that she intends to be tougher on Syria than her predecessor. I'm not buying this election talk. Like I said, the Americans have very little to gain from it, and a hell of a lot to lose. Hillary is a rational politician, and she will surely come to the conclusion that it is better to just bide the time and allow Putin to keep on making mistakes and losing ground. So I am not worried about the possibility of war, either hot or cold, breaking out between the US and Russia. The tension will continue until the situation in Ukraine and Syria is resolved, but that's all it will amount to. One thing that we can do to help is to calm down and see things as they are. All this talk about how Putin has aggressive plans against Europe is pushing people to demand leaders that will get tougher on Russia, and there's no need for it. As we've seen, Putin has only been losing ground, and he's fighting to preserve what little sphere of influence Russia's got left. There's no reason to think that he has any plans against anyone outside this sphere of influence. So don't fall for those who tell you that our weakness is inviting Russia to attack European countries. As for the Russians among you, you need to calm down about the idea that the West is out to get you. Nobody has any animosity towards Russians. Actually, a lot of us think that you're kind of awesome in some ways. Everyone just needs to relax.